Good morning, everyone. In the 1960s, Mick Jagger sang, "I'm free to do what I want any old time." Such an ability to be free to do what we want to do when we want to expresses a popular view of what freedom is. Thomas Jefferson, like Mick Jagger, also in his early 20s, when he wrote the Declaration of Independence about being created equal, stressed the right to be free from being under the control of a king. Likewise, nowadays, with respect to being required to receive a COVID vaccine, many in the US insist that they be left free to decide what happens to their bodies, not wanting the government to tell them what to do. Zen Buddhism sees freedom differently, understanding that what prevents us from being truly free is our own sense of self, itself a delusion, as also are the three poisons supporting that self: attraction, aversion, and indifference. Certainly, a common motive for practicing is desiring to become free from entrapment by such thoughts and emotions. Although this might appear to be counterintuitive to those who hold that our freedom needs protection mainly from things outside of ourselves. Knowing that this small self is the source of our suffering does not mean that we should or can get rid of it, no matter how likely one is to have wished at times that one could. Dogen's "to settle the self on the self" expresses something different. We all have had the experience when sitting of thoughts, those representatives of the first self in "to settle the self on the self," appear in our minds less and less until sometimes none are there, which is suggestive of the big self, the second self in "to settle the self on the self." Similar expressions could be settling the relative on the absolute, or settling practice on enlightenment, the latter being the same as practice and enlightenment are one. While it might be thought that we do zazen to make ourselves calmer, as doing it has such an effect, we are more likely to sit to be free from our small self, not by eliminating it, but by recognizing that we are something unimaginably bigger than that small self is just a part of. Usually, however, our culture supports our going after what we desire and rejecting what we don't desire, even though by bringing things towards us or pushing things away from us, we set up circumstances in which we are apt to suffer. The mistaken reasoning behind this is that getting our own way will make us happy. We think that by acting to help ourselves will make us satisfied, when it is as likely to cause us anxiety and fear. The opposite is true about doing things for others. This should be much more desirable, in that in not being selfish, we are apt not to suffer, while in being selfish, we are. If you do try testing out whether not being selfish leads to not suffering, be careful at the end of your doing that not to praise yourself for doing the right thing. This will turn your focus around 180 degrees to put you once again facing your small self. Such patting oneself on the back is, of course, an egocentric act. But if you do nevertheless find yourself doing this, don't get upset about that either. We should be open to ourselves, even as a mother is to her child. What Buddhism is about is accepting others. And we cannot be truly doing that without having first being accepting of ourselves. This, too, is settling the self on the self. This is in no way a free pass to be self-indulgent, however. Dogen said in the Genjo Koan, as you've heard before, conveying oneself towards all things is to carry out practice and enlightenment. Again, conveying oneself towards all things to carry out practice and enlightenment is delusion. All things coming and carrying out practice and enlightenment through the self is realization. That is, it is deluded to be looking for something, such as enlightenment, while on the other hand, it is not deluded to let things come to us, as then we are open to what is happening in our world, rather than trying to get something out of our world, or trying not to get something out of our world. The small self needn't be involved when we are not defining our world, but letting our world define us. Only in responding to our world is the self in play then. In all things coming and carrying out practice enlightenment, our self is not decided beforehand by us, but by our immediate circumstances. While it follows that trying to attain something, conveying oneself towards all things, is a deluded practice, it being about oneself, in taking care of others, the small self is not central. Such a practice, among other things, leaves us less inclination or time to think about ourselves. As you know, the Heart Sutra says, with nothing to attain, the bodhisattva depends on prajnaparamita, and the mind has no hindrances. Without any hindrances, no fears exist. What precedes this in the sutra is an abbreviated list of Shakyamuni Buddha's essential teachings, the existence of which, or at least relevance, is one by one denied. No eyes, no ears, no nose, no tongue. Okay. It ends up, of course, with where I just started quoting this, there is nothing to attain. This is in reference to being anything for us. This is in reference to there not being anything for us to gain from the Dharma, which is, after all, made up of thoughts. No longer in need of these teachings, then, of Buddha, the bodhisattva depends on prajnaparamita. A bodhisattva, enlightened being, relying instead on prajnaparamita, the perfection of prajna, which is his or her, a bodhisattva's, natural wisdom. The following, the mind has no hindrances, means the mind, subsequently, doesn't have any thoughts to be worked on. Hindrances being the previously mentioned three poisons, or all products of thought in general. not attached to either, we are left free of the problems created by thoughts originating in the small self. Therefore, as in, without any hindrances, no fears exist, we don't have any thought-based fears as well. Lacking these fears leaves us capable of accepting whatever comes to us from our world. And we find ourselves free to be happy in it also. Nirvana, the name Buddhists have given for the place where such freedom prevails, comes from the Sanskrit for, quote, extension, disappearance of the individual to the universal. This is from vocabulary.com. So that is, nirvana means the extinction or disappearance of the individual to the universal. Therefore, nirvana has the same meaning, the place where we are free. It means to settle the self on the self. Thank you. Here, can we go back over to Jane here? And I'll move it over a little bit more. Okay, here we are. Do you have any comments or questions? Anybody? Can you get what I was talking about?
Does everybody understand freedom that well?
Do you feel?
Dan?
Oh, Dan, yes, Daniel.
Good morning. A very nice talk. Would you describe it as more or less a map of Buddhist psychology?
In some sense, yes. Well, it's of not a it is Buddhist psychology, but of course it's a map of the path, and this is a certain part of the path. We of course need Dharma for a long time, but ultimately, Dharma is something relative. Even though it describes the absolute, it's still relative. Therefore, Dharma has to be given up. You have to depend on the basic you. So in a way, that's Buddhist psychology, yeah. Kind of before and after kind of thing, but like that. Okay. Thank you. Matt?
Okay.
Yeah, you had said relatively early in the talk about we act upon the three, I think I'm trying to recall how you phrased it, but primarily we act upon the three poisons as a byproduct of culture. I believe that's roughly how you phrased it, although if you could clarify that. And then before you do, I'd like to add that our genetic inheritance, I think, is the foundation of that evolution and how I mean, we've evolved into these social creatures, and culture is a byproduct of that. And I think it's very important that we understand that this goes all the way to instinct.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, first off, in the first case of when I use the word culture, I meant that society sees freedom in one way, and Buddhism sees freedom in another. And so mostly when we think about freedom, we are freedom from something. And that something is outside of ourselves. And I gave two, just for the fun of it, just the quotes of Mick Jagger and Thomas Jefferson. That was a good pairing, I thought. But yes, you're right, Matt. Yeah, I mean, that's basically how we operate. That's what Shakyamuni brought up. He brought up the fact that we are moved by what we like and what we don't like, and what we don't care either way about, and we act on those things, and that's the cause of our suffering. So it's important for Buddhists, well, for not Buddhists but practitioners, to understand that. I feel, because it's an essential part of where all of this comes from. But basically, our freedom is something internal. It doesn't come from something that comes from outside of ourselves. It's something that has to do with inside of ourselves. And we have to come to terms with how we cause ourselves to be unhappy. And nirvana is happiness. It's the freedom. I kind of combined those two, but that's freedom for us. Freedom from suffering, of course, is one thing, but it's internal suffering. It's not suffering caused by outside of ourselves. That doesn't mean that they are mutually exclusive, because of course there is suffering from outside of ourselves. But in our practice, is not about that. Our practice is about dealing with what's really taking place within us, and coming to terms and understanding it and going beyond it. Yes, Daniel, again? Matt, is that okay? Okay, yeah. Daniel?
Just a quick follow-up on that. Would you say then, therefore, that having free will causes suffering?
Oh, it's a whole other thing. Free will is a very Christian point of view. But so I have to think about that. I don't have a good. Anybody have an answer for that? That's a good question. Okay? Mark got an answer for it. Mark, I'll jump over John for a second. Mark.
I'll try to keep it short. It's talked about a lot in philosophy and in, let's say, my favorite subject, astrology, too, that we have, there's always the question, are the planets causing something? Or do we have free will? Or is our destiny mapped out for us, intimately already created in front of us? Or do we have free will in that sphere of what we do? And it seems that, I don't know for a definitive answer, it's like we live in a universe that you said the three principles, right? Were attraction, repulsion, and indifference, right?
Yeah, they can be called principles, but really they're called hindrances, or they're called poisons.
Well, Newton had some other terms for them too. And we live in a world, in a universe that supposedly is governed by that. But this world is always being discovered by our own mind and our own thoughts. And our thoughts are, where do they come from? So I think we're living in a lot of delusion about physical and mental inner and outer dimensions and all this stuff. I think it's as soon as we try to solve everything with our logical mind, I think we run into something. It's like the freedom is not having those thoughts and allowing everything. So
that's kind of like it. Yeah, not or actually not being disturbed by those thoughts.
Right. So as if you can have free will within the, let's say you feel like you're between a rock and a hard place in your life. You do have free will to make a choice in there. It can be reactive or proactive, but it's still a choice of thought.
Yeah.
So we're probably just fooling ourselves.
About what?
Yeah, in which way?
About everything. Because it's one big mess when you start, shifting through the sands to find the diamonds, and then you find that you really shifted all the diamonds and found sand. It's just an idea there.
Those must be chips, I guess. Yeah, John?
So carrying on a bit with your metaphor of freedom, so it would seem that then we are somewhat enslaved by our thoughts and our feelings, and that true freedom is when we no longer are so tied to our
Yes.
thoughts.
Yes, that's right. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you.
But I have to think about free will because it has does God, but of course it began also in philosophy, but it also began in within Christian philosophy. I don't know that at all about it actually, but I think that was a very important point of Thomas Aquinas, and for example, so God does God make us so much that we're just controlled, or do we have free will? We can choose to do right and wrong. That's what that kind of is. But our thing is not about is about being free from causing ourselves suffering, and then having seen that in ourselves, helping others with the same problem. Yes, Sandy.
It seems to me that the freedom to dwell in nirvana relies on your ability to surrender and to let go, to observe the mind, but not become attached to the thoughts that come from it. And it's the matter of free will. It seems it's a question that can't be answered. And, that do we have free will? We might think we do, but in essence, do we really? Our actions are generally from our previous behavior and how we see the world through our thoughts and our past experiences and what we've decided to believe. So does that really allow us freedom, to make choices? Or our choices are all preconditioned by our small mind and what we've attached to it? So it seems like one has to be dedicated to taking the leap and being able to let go of all that, to let go of the clasping onto small mind, and to just experience as much, it's like you said, we create all our internal suffering. And if we let go of that, then we can dwell in nirvana, at least temporarily, now and then.
Thank you. I like that. Yeah. Chris?
Yeah, I find myself thinking about this kind of frequently. But I think it's the kind of daydream that Jane was suggesting isn't so useful or actually even interesting. But Western philosophy is like obsessed with it. And it like really just comes down to the concept of free will is just a concept, and it has no actual bearing on life as we live it. It really, really, really seems like I have free will because I'll look at a choice and do one of them. And the entire time, I have this sense that I have agency. I am in control. I am doing it. But then, like cognitive psychology comes along and says, oh, well, actually, we've studied this and the decision happens right before the conscious experience of making the decision. So, we don't really have free will. But I really reject that story. I don't buy it. For one thing, I don't see the universe as being preordained or completely determinative, and I think that conclusion that we don't have free will because dot 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 cognitive psychology, karma, whatever the story behind the explanation that we don't have free will, essentially just means it's reinforcing the belief that the universe is completely determinative. I think the universe is pretty chaotic, actually, but even chaos and determination are also just concepts. This is a really, really good example of the kind of thing that, Buddha would say, the question does not suit the case, or maintain a noble silence, or just say, you're getting off topic. This is a red herring. Quit worrying about it. Because at the end of the day, if someone that I have put my entire faith in to tell me the truth says, yes, you have free will, I might find myself thinking, but do I though? And vice versa. At the end of the day, I've sort of settled on a story about free will that goes something like, I have free will to the extent that I take full responsibility. If I claim responsibility, I have free will. If I want to say it's out of my hands, then I'm not an agent of karma. I am, karma is what's sort of in control. But really, 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 neither of those is actually true. It's just a story, and less stories are actually helpful, and that's I have Zen to thank for that. Zen has been instrumental in revealing a lot of what I accepted as and took for granted for reality as just being sort of stories about reality, and through that then fostering or cultivating the kind of freedom that I think you were talking about, Peter. It's not the free will that Western culture views as free will is just the result of our karma and the sort of notion of freedom that we can do what we want. But then, as you said, if we are just doing what we want, then we're just slaves to our wants, or at least we have the chance to do what we want or not do what we want. But either way, we think that freedom is just doing what we want. But actual freedom is just being free from the story that generates these wants and the other desires and the other hindrances, and it's freedom the hindrances that Buddhism offers, and that is completely unconcerned with and unaffected by this notion of free will. And so I think that's even more support for the Buddhist notion of freedom as opposed to any other notion of freedom.
Thank you. That was very good. Yeah. Comprehensive there too. Yes, John?
Just a quick comment with regards to the free will. I would venture to say that true free will, as Chris just kind of hinted on there, only really comes when you're free of thought and feelings and bad habits and karma. And, what we may think is free will is just delusion. It's really when you're free of those tetherings that you're truly free and have free will.
Thank you. Yeah. Rachel?
Well, I just thought of it. I don't mean to be unnecessarily quippy, but since you're going to bring up Mick Jagger and Thomas Jefferson, there's always Janis Joplin. Freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose. And I don't usually, quote Janis Joplin, but I've always remembered that. Anyway, thank you for the freedom. And to me, freedom as well as free will is really context dependent. And sometimes people, usually they relate it to course of action, versus freedom to think. It's freedom to do, as you said. And someone, depending on century, country, can be content, and then they learn the person in the next country or next town or next county gets to do things they can't do. So all of a sudden, they're not free. And it just, I think free will, discussions about free will, not always, but tend to go into what I call the greed category. You think you have free will, aha, I've got free will. And it's like smash and grab. And, you know, one person's free will, someone else says, nah, 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 you think you have, you're like poker. It's like playing poker. And who's going to win the grand stakes on this? It matters. It matters terribly. And I'll just say, you know, someone who has a disability or illness, it's striking if you've known people or been a person with that, where you can feel trapped and sometimes understanding, even if the options don't change, you know, you really aren't going to get up and walk better, but you understand and there are small differences and you feel free. You have a freedom. And it really is freedom in your mind, as I think John said, about from not being tethered. Whereas in fact, the person who can just walk a few steps further, you know, if you can walk a lot, you don't think that's free, but they do. And if you've known someone well for whom that was true, or you yourself, you have a different grasp of how it's not quite so conceptual. It's really everyday living that's affected by feeling free or not free. But again, as you said, that internal sense, not the external as much. Thank you, Peter.
Beth?
I wanted to offer, I happen to be reading a book. It's called The Drunkard's Walk. I'll have to look up the author, forgive me, but it's about how randomness exists in our lives and probability and the mathematics of the drunkard's walk, I guess, is a term that relates to the path molecules take through space and how unpredictable they are. And so this aspect of probability is fascinating in the sense that we are really naturally quite terrible as humans in mentally calculating probabilities. And so many more decisions are made on what we identify as intuition rather than the mathematics of probability. And so just to blend a few things that people were saying about our human nature and how we've developed into social beings and we've developed into systems that have constructs and structures and then we build them up and we tear them down and everything is constantly in flux. But I found the aspect of randomness an interesting one in relationship to our sense of control, and that the trap that most people fall into is our human tendency to make meaning out of patterns that may or may not be real. And so then this circles back to the Buddhist second arrow of suffering, that yes, there might be suffering, but we add on the constructs that cause the deeper suffering. And so I thought people might find that book interesting in talking about free will. It's called The Drunkard's Walk, The Role of Randomness in Everyday Life, or something like that. I can type it in at the end.
It's Leonard Mlodinow now.
There you go. See?
I mean,
thank you, Rachel.
Okay, here we go. Sandy?
Rachel's talk, well, maybe it wasn't Rachel's. I think it was. It reminded me of when I was working way back when. I had made a friend, and it was a young man in his 20s, probably approaching his mid to late 20s. And he was in a wheelchair. And he would come by all the time because he was a representative for one of the products I bought. And we eventually got to know a little bit about each other. And I found out that he played wheelchair basketball. And listening to him and knowing his story about how he got injured and he was unable to move from the waist down. I've seen that crush people to the point where they get totally depressed and can't go on with their lives. But this young guy, he went out, he built his upper body up, he decided to participate in sports, and he just did what he, wanted to do. He went and became someone who would come and visit different, companies and promote a product and had a good paying job. He had a vehicle that he was able to drive with his hands rather than his feet. And it was like he had just created this bubble of freedom about himself because he did not believe that he couldn't do these things. He didn't listen to doubts and feelings from within. He went beyond that. He knew that he could accomplish what he wanted to accomplish in life, and that the wheelchair wasn't going to hold him back or deny him a life. And to me, that's freedom. When you can overcome the doubt and all that within yourself, that life is over after something like that. That's true freedom. That's freedom to go on living and experiencing life and enjoying it. And it was really nice to see that. And throughout the time I worked, I found there were many different people that I met. People from, our soldiers that came in, and we supported a charity, UCLA, that allowed these vets to come in that had disfiguring or had problems that couldn't be solved through the VA hospital, and allowed them to bring their family, and were put up in a house near UCLA and were given treatment, and it changed their lives. And that too was like, you're offering someone a helping hand, and that helping hand just opens their life up and allows them to live again and to participate in the world. That too, if you look around, there's all these experiences that you can see of freedom. And there's also all the experiences you can see in everyday life when you look at people around you that are so trapped that there is no freedom. They're so trapped by their own mind. And
well, Buddhism is about that, right? Buddhism is about, yes. Although in the case of the young man you're talking about, he had no connection to Buddhism at all. But anyway, Buddhism, is saying we are trapped by ourselves.
Yes.
And so how do you deal with that? And so that's the greater. That's the wrong word here. That's a different type of freedom anyway. But actually, actually, what's been brought out by the discussion here is it's very complicated. But Buddhism, what's nice about Buddhism is it says, well, why are you unhappy? It's not because of psychology, but particularly, we're unhappy because the way we're built, that we do that to ourselves, and so we really have that freedom. We have the ability. We have the freedom to become free. From that point of view. But of course, there's various types of freedom, and a lot of people, the freedom from the external circumstances is paramount. It comes first, for sure. Yes, Matt?
Yeah. You just mentioned there are different types of freedom. I'm going to select one, which would be freedom of choice. And I spent my 20s and a large degree of my 30s obsessed with this question of, do we have free choice, which I at the time was using the word will, or don't I, because it was a fundamental question for me about suffering. Because if I did not, then I was not responsible for my failings. I wasn't responsible for hurting others. And as a byproduct of that, I felt the sense, and others were not either, and the degree of anger that I felt, because I did conclude that I was not responsible, and I'll explain that briefly in a moment. Because that anger subsided, the anger with myself for things that I regretted doing, the anger at others that I felt because they were doing things that I disliked. As a simple word, I was averse to. And letting go of that anger was very, very helpful in terms of the degree of suffering I experienced. But, looking at it more closely, when you look at yourself as being determined, and there are all sorts of philosophical arguments about how we're determined, but I mean, to get to the simplest argument, being determined both by desire and aversion, that's the simplest argument. We're determined by desire and aversion and anger. When we experience anger, we act on it. So if you just look at it from that standpoint, you realize that, I may not be responsible, but my God, I'm a slave to these things. And just because I don't feel myself responsible anymore, I continue to live as if I am responsible. I continue to get angry. I continue to blame others and myself, because that's how I'm wired. Forget Christian morality, or Judeo-Christian morality, forget all of that, or any other culture. This is fundamental to us in terms of being social beings. And so, but the realization that you're just either you're responsible or you're a slave to these things. How are you going to live with either of those? And so this is where my desire to free myself in the sense that Buddhism directs came from.
Okay,
So,
thank you. Daniel? Daniel?
I'm just wondering, Sandy's young man sounds like a bodhisattva. The one that very much so. So, trying to be inclusive there. I'm just wondering, with all the detailed prescription within Buddhism, if freedom in Buddhism winds up being freedom from choice, because all the actions become very prescribed in terms of the intentionality of achieving some sort of nirvana. I mean, did you choose to be a Buddhist priest, or, I mean, did you choose to do that, or do you feel that you had a call, or it was almost predetermined?
Oh, you're asking me personally, as I guess, huh? Um, I was, trained as trained only, but anyway, I went to university as an engineer, and my predilection is, does it work or doesn't it work? This I was a chemical engineer rather than a chemist. There's a difference. The engineer figures out how to use the theory of chemistry to do things with it, and so if Suzuki Roshi was here instead of me, I think, or anybody, but let's just choose him from that. He would be quite amused by our interest in free will and things like that, because it is a part of our culture. But I think ultimately, Buddhism says, well, it really, as Chris said, it's really not relevant to our lives. Now, when it be, and I think, once again, Mark came up with said we have that thing in astrology. Astrology tells you what your future is. How can that be possible? Are we free then or not free? But in Buddhism says even that is not relevant. The reason being free or not free are just ideas. They may control us, but they're just ideas. And Buddhism says you are unhappy because of the way you think and the way you act upon, your what you like and what you don't like and don't care about. Mark, yeah.
Since you brought me up, I'm going to make it short.
Okay.
I think we're in a kind of a mind trap here. The Jewish have a great proverb. They say, when offered two choices, always pick the third. I'll leave it at that.
I never heard that before.
It's so wise. It is so wise. It just destroys a lot of little traps we put ourselves in.
Yeah.
Can I?
Jane.
I'd like to say something here. I think, the whole idea of free will is just a thought more than anything else. And that free will, is just, if you have free will, then you don't have free will. So it's another one of the opposites again that get us running around in circles, and it only depends on opinions finally and facts of somebody with opinions. And so I think there's another way of looking at it too, is that there is a kind of choice, but it's not a physical or mental choice. It's more like, it's the kind of choice that happens when you're unconscious of your real motive acting out things. For example, in the Osue classes I mentioned before, when people would draw what the teacher drew right down to the lines and the dots, and they practiced that for a month, making the same drawing, always copying the dots, always copying the lines, and making it as much like the teachers as possible. But when they came to the show time, they made their own. They just drew the picture. And again, in their mind, they were drawing what they had learned. And so if you went to the show and looked at the pictures, every picture in there looked like a different picture. There was almost no connection, except you might see a ball in the ground or something. But there was so much difference that nobody had intended to do, and yet was there because their character, their uniqueness was all different. And I think that's the way we have real free will, is when we do what the talk today was about, settling the self on the self. In other words, joining your relative mind with your vast open mind. And so at that point, you're not trying to do anything. You are simply expressing the relative and the absolute together. You are expressing yourself as a whole being, and that's the real free choice we have. so that whatever you do will express this whole person without thinking it, without making the choice in your mind. You will naturally express it without thought even. So I think our free choice is really when we unite as relative and absolute in our everyday living experiences, rather than trying to think out or work out some kind of idea. That's what I think.
Arvin?
I've been making a rakusu, and it's been slow going, right? And Phil's been helping me, and Jane's been helping me. So yesterday I had a Zoom meeting with Tim Wicks, the guy at the San Francisco Zen Center who's helping us out making this stuff. And he shows me, the patterns, on the Zoom. And watch me, Arvin, watch me, look at me. Don't look at your own thing, look at me, he says. So I'm looking at his stuff, right? And I'm very, it's like, okay, I don't dare look down. I'm just going to look at what you're doing. Right? And and afterwards, said, his stuff looked very different, right? It looked very different. He said, look at me. You got to do it this way. You got to pin it exactly like this. The edge has got to be like this. The line's got to go not on the edge. It's going to go one half of the end of the needle in, right? And, and I was, okay, all right. And afterwards, can I ask a question? He said, yes. And so I showed him my thing and I said, look at mine. It looks nothing like yours. And then he looked at me and he said, haven't you been listening? You don't do what I'm doing. You do what you're going to do. You just saw what I did. But afterwards, you're just going to do your thing. And I don't care about that. So that was interesting, right? Like, I feel like, great. Then this morning, I was making a big breakfast, extended family over and everything. And I got all these pots lined up on the counter, and I had eggs going and potatoes and sausages and all kinds of stuff. And it was looking really good and very colorful. And I lifted this beautiful blue bowl with, milk and stuff like that. I was lifting it up and I lost it. And it fell on the cast iron pot edge and shattered. And there was blue shards and milk all over all the food.
Oh my goodness.
And everybody's like, oh my God, what happened? What happened? And there's these blue shards in the omelet. And they look beautiful. They just look amazing. There's these tiny little pieces that are like a pattern. So there's things change, it's remarkable.
What did you eat?
Oh, I just started all over.
Oh, I see. Oh, okay. Oh.
Actually, that's a good comment about the Roxu, though, because that's exactly what happens. You learn how to do it, but you do it. You're as you are. So your Roxu is you. It's not like somebody else's. It was like the Osue paintings. They were just individual, so personal that it was hard to believe that they all had studied the same thing. So finally, when you do act, you act as yourself. I think that's real freedom, is the freedom to just be exactly who you are when you're doing things.
Okay. Phil? Sandy, I'm going to get you in the end here, but I want that other people get the answer here. You Phil?
So my advice to you, Arvind, is the next time you meet with Peter, show him the omelet and say, here's my Roxu.
Sandy?
Well, Arvin, it's your artistic eye that saw those patterns in the omelet. Most people would just scream and go, "Oh my God, what did I do?" But I wanted to respond to Matt's little talk there. When you described how you were still reacting to anger and to all these other negativities that are coming through your mind, it made me feel that you've never forgiven yourself for your past deeds. It sounded like you're still holding on to them, and that in itself will stop you from finding the quote freedom that you might be looking for. And Jane had mentioned it to me too when I was having some problems, and she said, you have to go through this process of studying yourself and letting go and forgiving yourself for those past deeds, and just let them be, and move forward. Don't stay in the past with them. Don't keep dragging them forward with you. And so that part of Buddhism, that being able to study and search the self, and to be able to forgive yourself for your past actions, because the past is gone. It doesn't exist anymore, is really important. It's a really important step, I think, to being able to find those little spots of nirvana in your life.
Well, thank you, Sandy. Thank you. Well,
You're welcome.